In a quiet Swedish village, a girl disappeared without moving, speaking or aging as the world spun past her bed. Locals claim it was 32 years, but documents hint at gaps, small moments of motion, and questions about who she really was when she finally woke. Karolina Olsson's story is not just about sleep. It's a puzzle buried in letters, diaries, and rumours that refuse to line up neatly. Neighbours reported missing candy, furniture moved in the night, and a young woman who returned yet did not recognise her own brothers. Some said she was possessed, some said she had been replaced, and some simply shook their heads. Modern historians and neurologists try to map her condition with EEGs, coma scales, and forensic timelines, yet nothing fully explains the mystery. Was it a prolonged illness, an unknown neurological state, or something that folklore would call uncanny? It began on a cold February evening in 1876. The island of Oknö, a small patch of land off the east coast of Sweden in the Baltic Sea, was a tight-knit fishing village where everyone knew each other by name. Life there moved slowly, and people depended on the sea for food and survival. In one of the small cottages near the water lived the Olsson family. Karolina was 14 then, the only daughter among 5 brothers. Her father, a fisherman, worked long hours in the freezing wind while her mother tended to the home. They were a simple, hard-working family who made do with what they had. Karolina had just begun her first year of proper school, in the autumn before. Her mother had taught her to read and write at home, but the church had started insisting that every child learn their catechism formally. That February, the sea around Oknö had frozen solid. Locals often used the ice to cross between parts of the island or to reach the mainland faster. On February 18th, Karolina decided to take a shortcut across a frozen river. Something went wrong along the way. She slipped, hit her head hard against the ice, and came home bruised and shaken. Her father later said she didn't seem badly hurt at first. She had scrapes on her face and arms, but she was alert and speaking. He thought rest and warmth would be enough. But that night, Karolina began to complain about pain in her head and a sharp ache in her teeth. Her mother thought it was just a result of the fall, but as the pain grew worse, the family started to fear something more. People on the island were deeply religious, but they also believed in old superstitions. This was the 1800s, so belief in curses and witches was still common, and on the island, such stories were part of everyday life. When Karolina's pain became unbearable, her mother complained to a neighbour that maybe someone had placed a spell on her. Within a day, that fear spread through the small village. 4 days after her fall, on February 22nd, Karolina went to bed early. Her mother told her to rest and prayed that sleep would bring her strength. But when morning came, Karolina did not wake up. At first they assumed she was only in a deep sleep, but as the hours dragged on, and then an entire day, panic began to set in. Her parents tried everything they could think of. They shouted her name, they poured cold water over her face, they even pinched her skin and poked her with sewing needles. One of her brothers, desperate, held a candle close enough to her cheek, but she didn't even flinch. It was as if she had drifted to a place far beyond reach. With no money for a hospital visit, the family turned to the local midwife for help. She suggested feeding Karolina sweetened milk to keep her alive. Every day her mother forced 2 glasses of milk down her throat, drop by drop. Weeks passed like this, then months. The girl stayed still. Neighbours grew uneasy. Some thought the Olssons were cursed. Others said that Karolina was caught between life and death. Finally, the villagers collected what little money they could and sent for a doctor from the mainland. When he arrived, he tried everything from smelling salts to pricking her fingers and even her tongue with sharp instruments. Nothing worked. She didn't stir or make a sound. He told the family that their daughter was in a coma and that there was little anyone could do. The doctor stayed in touch with the family for a year, checking on her whenever he visited the area. In one report, he wrote that her body showed no signs of decay or neglect. Her hair and nails didn't grow, her skin stayed pale but smooth, and she kept breathing slowly and steadily. He later wrote a letter to a leading medical journal, hoping other doctors might help him understand the strange case of the sleeping girl of Oknö. Over time, other doctors came to see her. One of them, Johan Emil Almblad, described Karolina's state as hysteria, a diagnosis that was often used for women with mysterious illnesses in that era. His assessment did not convince everyone. Another doctor suspected a kind of brain fever. No one agreed on what she was suffering from. Years later, in 1892, Karolina was moved to a hospital in Oskarshamn for observation. Doctors there tried to wake her using electric shocks, a new treatment at the time. But she didn't move. After a month, they sent her home with a diagnosis that made little sense: dementia paralytica, a disease often linked to late-stage syphilis. But even they admitted there was no proof she had the illness. It was just another name for something they couldn't explain. More than 15 years had now passed since the night she fell on the ice. But Karolina's story didn't end there. In fact, that's when it took an even more unbelievable turn. Years began to pass and the small Olsson cottage in Oknö grew quieter with every season. People no longer came by to check if Karolina was alive. They came to see if the stories were true. Over time, villagers began calling her the Sleeping Beauty of Oknö. Some said her body looked as though it had been frozen in time. Her skin stayed smooth, her face unchanged, and her hair never seemed to grow. Even her nails, according to the doctors who visited, stayed the same length year after year. These doctors came from all across Sweden, each one hoping to be the one who finally solved the mystery. Many of them left more puzzled than when they arrived. They wrote in their journals about her steady pulse and her slow, even breathing. They noted how her muscles stayed firm and how her body showed no signs of wasting away. None of it made sense. How could a person sleep for years and not turn grey? Some believed her mother's story, that Karolina survived on 2 glasses of milk and sugar water each day. Others said that it was impossible and that something was being hidden. Some moments kept people guessing. Karolina wasn't always still. Her family said that sometimes in the middle of the night she would move slightly in bed, mumble words from old prayers, or cry out as if caught in a nightmare. Her father once told a neighbour that he had seen her crawl across the floor on her hands and knees, whispering, "Good Jesus, have mercy on me." But when anyone tried to wake her, she would fall silent again, her eyes closed, her face calm. When Karolina's mother died in 1904, the care of the house fell to others. A maid was hired to help. At first, she thought the stories about Karolina were exaggerated. But after a few weeks in the cottage, she began to notice things that troubled her. Karolina's hair always looked clean, even though she was never washed. Her nails never seemed to grow, and sometimes when the maid left sweets in the room, they would disappear. She swore she never saw Karolina eat them, yet the candies were gone. Even with these strange hints of life, Karolina never spoke. The maid said she never once heard her voice. But when one of Karolina's brothers died in 1907, something remarkable happened. The maid said she found Karolina lying in bed, tears rolling down her cheeks. She was weeping quietly, still motionless, but aware enough to grieve. It was the first time anyone had seen emotion from her in years. To the locals, Karolina's home began to feel almost sacred. People came from nearby towns to stand outside and pray. Some left gifts or crosses at the doorstep. Others simply stood in silence, staring at the small window where the Sleeping Beauty lay. What no one could have known then was that her sleep would last 32 years. And when she finally opened her eyes, the quiet fishing island that had guarded her secret would suddenly find itself at the centre of the world's attention. In the early morning on April 3rd, 1908, something stirred in the small cottage on Oknö. The maid, who had been tending to Karolina since her mother's death, heard a noise that made her pause. At first it sounded like a small object falling. Then came the faint sound of crying. She rushed to the bedroom and found Karolina out of bed. She was standing, trembling and unsure on her feet. The maid later said she saw fear in Karolina's eyes. Her first words were, "Where's mother?" Karolina had no memory of her mother's passing years ago. The gap in her awareness was shocking. When her brothers arrived, they could hardly believe what they saw. Their sister, who had been asleep for most of their lives, now sat before them, her expression confused. She did not recognize them and said they weren't her brothers because they had been so small. The last time she had seen them, they were children. Now they were grown men. Her voice was slow and weak, and she covered her eyes from the sunlight in the room. For several days, she barely spoke at all. When she finally began to answer questions, she admitted that everything, after her fall on the ice at 14, had vanished from her memory. The 32 years of her life in between were a blank. Soon, doctors and reporters from across Sweden and even Europe arrived, eager to witness the woman who had slept for decades. They noticed she was calm and distant. Her body was healthy and balanced, her skin smooth, and her muscles worked normally. Tests of memory and language revealed her mind to be sharp. She could read and write, and her old teachers confirmed that her cognitive abilities were intact. But the world she awoke to was strange. Electric lights, telephones, new fashions, and changes in the monarchy left her disoriented. And yet, despite being 46 years old, she appeared decades younger. Witnesses later described her as looking no older than a woman in her late 20s or early 30s. That day, people felt like they were seeing more than just a miracle. It was as if someone from the past had suddenly returned to a world that had moved on without her. And as word spread, people began coming up with their own explanations for what really happened to her. After Karolina woke up, newspapers talked about medicine and science, but in small villages across Sweden, people were telling a different story. To the people who had watched her sleep for more than 30 years, this was not an illness that doctors could explain. It was a miracle. From the beginning, the Olsson family had believed that something spiritual had taken hold of their daughter. They came from a place where faith in God mixed easily with old fears of witches and spells. When Karolina first fell into her strange sleep, her parents told neighbours that she had been cursed by a group of witches who had tormented her spirit. They said she was trapped between two worlds, her body here on earth, but her soul wandering somewhere else. People silently said that she was living in a place between life and death. Priests who visited the cottage often left feeling uneasy, not sure how to explain what they had seen. Some parishioners even compared her to the saints who were said to have slept for years, before rising again, renewed. To them, Karolina wasn't just a girl. She was a sign that heaven hadn't turned its back on earth, especially with the story her father told about how she once sat up in bed, with her eyes closed and cried out, asking Jesus for mercy. To the family, that moment showed her spirit was still alive, even though her body wouldn't wake up. When she finally woke up in 1908, people said it was like seeing someone rise from the grave. Villagers gathered outside the cottage to pray and sing hymns of thanksgiving. They spoke of Karolina as a woman chosen by God to show that the soul can survive what the body cannot. Some even said her awakening was a reminder of the stories from Scripture, of Lazarus or the prophets who slept, and then returned renewed. The way her body had remained untouched only deepened their faith. The fact that during her long sleep her hair and nails didn't grow, and her skin looked as smooth as when she was a girl, made it seem even more miraculous. To those who believed this was not a trick of nature, but a sign of divine preservation. They said her body had been protected from decay while her spirit waited. And the way she looked half her age, even at 46, was seen as another sign of something divine. Her face stayed smooth and clear, and her hands looked gentle and young. People said that no ordinary woman could have survived like that unless she had been watched over by heaven. But not everyone saw her awakening as a blessing. Some thought there was something else behind it, something that didn't feel holy at all. When Karolina Olsson woke up, some villagers started saying the woman who came back wasn't really her. The face looked the same, but they believed the person inside was different. In Scandinavia, these kinds of stories are old and common. People have told tales for centuries about spirits or beings that take on human form and live among people. Folklorists like Bengt of Klintberg and storytelling scholars such as Lisbeth Larsson have documented these traditions, showing how communities interpreted strange behaviour or sudden changes in identity through tales of beings that could borrow flesh. The sudden, inexplicable return of someone who had been gone from the world seemed to fit these patterns perfectly. Neighbours talked about small but strange events that had occurred while Karolina lay in bed. The maid reported that candy sometimes disappeared from cupboards, and furniture would seem to be moved or replaced. Little things, but enough to unsettle the household and make people question what they were seeing. In a culture where people believed unseen forces could affect the world, many took these signs as proof that something else might have been controlling her body long before she woke up. When Karolina finally woke up, things only got stranger. Since she didn't recognize her brothers and spoke as if the people around her were different, many began to think her memories had been changed or mixed up. Her looking much younger than a 46-year-old were seen as more proof that she wasn't the same girl they once knew, but something else living in her place. These suspicions connect to old Nordic stories about doubles or spirits that copy people and come back in another body. Some experts say the person who returns in these stories often seems almost perfect, but not quite right. They don't act threatening, but something about them feels off. Karolina's confusion about her family and her sense of time match those old stories in a way that felt strangely familiar. Karolina Olsson wasn't the only one in history to slip into a long, unexplained sleep. Stories from other countries show that similar things happen to people who are called the sleeping girls, or the silent angels of their towns. Take Ellen Sadler, for example. She was a young girl from Turville in England who, in 1871, suddenly fell into a deep sleep that lasted for years. People watched over her and tried to care for her, but no one could explain why she stayed unresponsive for so long. She would sometimes wake briefly, but mostly she remained still and quiet, much like Karolina. Then there is Anna Katharina Ehmer from Germany in the 1910s. She became known as the Silent Angel because she stopped speaking and hardly moved for months. Doctors recorded her condition carefully, and people were telling stories about why she had fallen into such a state. Some thought it was grief or shock. Others suspected more mysterious forces. Looking at all these cases side by side is pretty surprising. Different places, different times, but the same strange pattern shows up. Young people, mostly girls, slipping into long states of sleep or silence that no one can fully explain. So what do scientists, psychologists and doctors actually think about stories like this? And what could explain what happened to Karolina Olsson? Back in the 19th century, the medical field had a framework for thinking about unusual conditions like hers. It was called hysteria, a diagnosis that covered a range of symptoms without clear physical causes. People with hysteria could show paralysis, numbness, or even periods of unconsciousness, and it was understood as a response to overwhelming emotional stress. Paul Briquet, for example, spent a decade compiling hundreds of cases where patients displayed unexplained symptoms across the body, showing that the mind could strongly influence the body. In France, Jean-Martin Charcot studied hysteria systematically and used hypnosis to explore how trauma and heredity might trigger these responses in the nervous system. Symptoms like Olsson's, including long-term immobility and numbness, were very much part of what doctors saw in hysteria cases. Later psychologists built on these ideas. Pierre Janet said hysteria could come from a strong idea in the subconscious that shows up in the body. He called this dissociation, where a person's mind splits, causing memory loss, trouble moving, and other big changes. Sigmund Freud and Joseph Breuer added that hidden conflicts in the mind could turn into physical symptoms called hysterical conversion. These symptoms might help the person in some way, like easing inner stress or getting attention and care. Karolina Olsson, living in a rural area where emotional struggles were often expressed through the body rather than words, is said to fit the profile of someone who could enter an extreme dissociative state. Modern neurologists and historians have also taken a careful look at Karolina Olsson's case, trying to see it through the eyes of medicine and science we have today. People like Dr. Tor Nielsen, who studies sleep and dissociation, or historians combing through 19th century psychiatric records, offer a very different story. They suggest that what looked like miraculous sleep might have been a prolonged illness, misread because the tools to measure consciousness simply didn't exist back then. In the late 1800s, doctors didn't have machines to check brain activity, and tools like the Glasgow Coma Scale didn't exist yet. Diagnoses depended on observation, patient responses, and sometimes guesswork. So when Karolina lay motionless for years, people assumed she was in some sort of mystical or extreme sleep. But today we can reinterpret those same symptoms as consistent with catatonia, a condition linked to psychiatric or neurological disorders. Catatonia can make someone appear completely unresponsive for long stretches, but inside, the brain is still active. Neurologists point to several clues in her medical history. The timeline of her illness, for example, aligns with what we now know about prolonged dissociative states triggered by trauma. Period psychiatry records from that era describe cases of sleeping sickness that, at first glance, resembled Karolina's condition. In many of these cases, young women would withdraw from daily life, stop speaking, eat very little, and appear unconscious for weeks or months. Some even lasted years, but the underlying mechanism was emotional or neurological, not magical. They were experiencing the body's extreme response to stress or psychological shock. EEG studies on patients with catatonia or dissociative stupor today show patterns that would have been invisible to 19th century physicians. You can see the brain is still processing information, even when outwardly there is no movement. That could explain how Karolina eventually woke up and returned to normal life without obvious cognitive damage. Her brain had been in a kind of suspended state, not dead or completely offline. Even coma scales help make things clearer. Today, doctors can check how alert someone is, how their eyes move, their reflexes, and how they respond to touch or sound. Looking back at Karolina's case, experts think she was probably somewhere between what we now call a minimally conscious state and catatonia. She wasn't really asleep. Her body and mind were slowed down, her awareness was low, but she was still alive and keeping basic functions going. Historians also note that social context mattered. In her village, pressures on young women, family stress, and limited medical knowledge made her case stand out. Reports from doctors, journalists, and family often mix what they saw with their own interpretations, so it is hard to separate fact from exaggeration. So, looking at biological timelines and modern ideas about dissociation, some experts suggest she may have been in a long, self-induced trance after trauma. They describe it as an extreme reaction of the human brain under stress, not as something miraculous or mystical. Even early psychologists in Sweden, when they examined Karolina's case, began to see her not as some mystical figure, but as a person whose mind had withdrawn from the world. Harold Fröderström, a Swedish psychiatrist, spent time with her in 1910 and documented her decades-long unresponsiveness. He also suggested that her long sleep might have been a self-induced trance, a way of coping with deep emotional distress. Some researchers even suspected that her mother may have helped maintain this state, creating a kind of protective cocoon around her. More researchers think Karolina's body might have slowed down a lot, almost like it was in suspended animation. People who watched her for years said her hair, fingernails and toenails barely grew. She kept her weight even though she ate almost nothing, just a little milk and sugar water each day. These details suggest her body may have slowed its activity to an extreme level, something scientists now call hypometabolism. We see similar things in nature. Bears hibernate for months, slowing their heart rate and metabolism to save energy. Tiny creatures called tardigrades can almost completely stop their metabolism and survive conditions that would kill most other life. Modern science in a field called cryobiology studies how life can keep going when metabolism is very slow or paused. The idea is that living things can appear almost frozen, but still stay alive, needing very little energy or oxygen. In labs, some tissues have even survived being frozen and brought back to life, showing how tough life can be. Karolina wasn't frozen, but her case is similar. Her body works slowly enough that time seemed to have very little effect. And also, what parts of Karolina's story are proven facts and what parts are just legend. For instance, the idea that Karolina Olsson slept continuously for 32 years might not be as exact as it sounds. It's possible that she had periods of consciousness, small windows where she was aware but not fully active. That changes the way you picture the story. It wasn't just one long, uninterrupted sleep. It is also argued that journalists of the time were eager to sensationalize unusual events, and small exaggerations could have slowly built the legend. But even after all these years, Karolina Olsson's long sleep is still a real mystery. Scientists can guess things like catatonia, dissociation, or her metabolism slowing way down, but none of it really explains how she lasted so long, and the more you look at it, the more questions pop up.